Decisions made in Washington can affect your portfolio every day. But what policy changes should investors be watching? Washington Wise is an original podcast from Charles Schwab that unpacks the stories making news in Washington right now and how they may affect your finances and portfolio. Listen at schwab.com/WashingtonWise. Decisions made in Washington can affect your portfolio every day. But what policy changes should investors be watching? Washington Wise is an original podcast from Charles Schwab that unpacks the stories making news in Washington right now and how they may affect your finances and portfolio. Listen at schwab.com/WashingtonWise. Hello and welcome to the Slate Political Gabfest. February 20th, 2025, the Justice Department is dire edition. I'm David Plotz of CityCast in Washington, D.C., from New Haven, Connecticut, and the New York Times Magazine, and Yale University Law School. And her attic is Emily Bazelon. Hello, Emily.
Hi. I'm in my dining room, but I like my attic. I'll be in my attic later.
Okay. And her dining room. From New York City, where he is the co-anchor of the CBS Evening News and the host of CBS Evening News Plus.
Am I I'm the co-anchor of one and the host of the other? I think I'm the co-anchor of one and the anchor of the other.
Oh.
Huh.
Okay.
No. I like the idea that I'm the host. It feels more comfortable.
Okay.
It feels more comfortable.
Like you're the host.
What kind of chair do you get to sit in?
Is it the same chair?
It's the same chair. They just move it over because it's just me.
It's John Dickerson. His chair moves side to side every day. This week on the Gabfest, the corrupt bargain with New York Mayor Eric Adams, the ethical crisis that is mushrooming in the American system of justice. Then, now that Elon Musk and his minions are gaining access to all the most sensitive government data about you and your disabilities and your taxes and your health, what could possibly go wrong? Then, have progressives ruined the ability of government to get anything done? We'll talk to Marc Dunkelman about his provocative new book. Then we will have cocktail chatter, of course. It was never going to be me. Emily reminded us of this amazing line in one of the resignation letters this week. Resignation letter from a federal prosecutor who refused to go along with a just blatantly, disturbingly corrupt scheme of the Trump Justice Department. The Eric Adams case is an astonishing spectacle of corruption in full flower. The New York mayor, federally indicted on some very persuasive sounding corruption charges, seems to have struck a deal with the Trump administration, although no one is acknowledging it quite directly. He would do their work on immigration and they would get the charges against him dropped. But it was structured as a form of extortion. The Justice Department official supervising this, Emil Bove, arranged to drop these charges or tried to drop these charges without prejudice so that they could always be brought back again, presumably if Adams failed to cooperate. This effort required cooperation from prosecutors in the Southern District of New York, which had brought the charges against Adams, including the extremely conservative acting U.S. Attorney Danielle Sassoon. Sassoon and 7 other prosecutors resigned, sending eloquent, outraged letters rather than perform this duty of signing off on dropping these charges. Bove then threatened to fire the whole office effectively unless one of them would sign his order. One of them fell on his sword so the others would not lose their jobs. It's a manhandling of the fair administration of justice like we have never seen, at least in our lifetime, I think. So, Emily, before we get to the specifics, I actually want to start with a broader question, which is that you spent a long time in the run-up to the election investigating how the Trump Justice Department might work. And you talked to 50 former officials about what could unfold. And I would say that what's happening so far seems even worse than the worst predictions. Or am I being histrionic?
I don't think you're being histrionic. What we're seeing so far is leniency as a form of deal making and what looks like partial as opposed to impartial administration of justice. So if I'm choosing between letting someone off the hook for bad reasons versus investigating, indicting, ruining lives in the other direction, I would choose this direction. But the level of interference with ethics and norms and people's sense of oath of office, that is as bad, if not worse, as anyone predicted when I was talking to these folks before the election.
My recollection was that there were many people who even had served in the first Trump administration said essentially, no, none of this stuff will happen. It'll basically... Trump believes in credentialed lawyers, and they seem to be suggesting that like the Justice Department would basically operate as it has in the past, maybe a little bit more conservative or a little more paying a little less attention to the Civil Rights Division and more attention to something else, but that within normal boundaries.
Most of the people I interviewed were more alarmed than that, but you're totally right. There were a few key people who said what you are summarizing. And I think there was this faith in the civil service, in the norms of lawyering, in the idea that there aren't that many political appointees in the Justice Department. There are fewer at the FBI, and that just entrenched sense of the way that the department functions was going to overcome these political appointees. And I just think what we're seeing, and I mean, obviously not just at the Justice Department, is a willingness to just like run roughshod over all of those ideas and just leave people completely scrambled in how these offices have ever operated. I mean, Danielle Sassoon, who was the interim U.S. attorney in the Southern District of New York, and Hagan Scotton, who was the lead prosecutor for Adams, like these are deeply conservative people. They're not, messing around with the Trump administration because like they don't like Republicans or even they don't like Donald Trump. They were just like, you are telling me to drop these charges for completely bogus reasons in order to influence policy by a public official. And that's just like not how it works. These are supposed to be separate zones. And this goes to this core question of the conundrum of the Justice Department. It is, in fact, an agency of the executive branch. It is, in fact, reporting ultimately to the president as its boss. But since Watergate, we've had these rules in place that were supposed to minimize political influence and prevent it from having exactly the kind of effect it has here. And now we just see a completely different approach to the president using the Justice Department as a tool.
So what is corrupt about this deal exactly? So the Wall Street Journal, of course, had an op-ed saying, there are lots of prosecutions that are conditioned on behavioral changes or non-prosecutions. That
deferred, yes. Decisions not to continue a case to conviction.
They'll tell a corporation, we're not going to prosecute you and you have to do X, Y, and Z. And this is just the same thing. But it's not.
Well, it's not because this is a public official and a politician exercising Eric Adams being the mayor of New York saying like, yeah, okay, come on in. We'll hand over all the immigrants you want to detain and expel. I also think those deferred prosecution deals with corporations are often like go way too far. You can also have a critique of that mode of operating.
And also those deferred prosecutions are generally the corporation is told not to behave in particular ways related to the crime. Whereas this totally. Would be, I mean, you can imagine deferred prosecution of Eric Adams, which says, we're not going to prosecute you, but you've got to stop meeting with Turkish officials and stop doing, taking bribes like that. Instead you have to stop doing this thing, or you have to start doing this thing in a totally other, completely unrelated thing. And that's the sort of Damocles we're going to hang over you. It has nothing to do with your actual behavior in this regard. It has to do with you carrying out our political ends.
Exactly. And this was punctuated by this, really cringy performance on Fox where Adams is sitting there next to Tom Homan, the Trump immigration official, and Homan is saying like, we're going to be on your butt to make sure you follow through. I mean, even absent the corruption prosecution, it would have been gross. But with that backdrop, it just seemed like they were actually showing us, even if it wasn't exactly the same deal that was at issue in dropping the charges, it just felt like you could see the Trump administration manipulating the mayor of New York like a puppet.
just to note, this doesn't have to do really with what's happening, but the way in which the Trump administration, that so much part of the menu of it is performative humiliation of people. Like, it's not enough that people have to do things. Power has to be demonstrated against them. They have to be publicly forced to eat the shit. And that's a classic behavior that you see in authoritarian regimes. Like, it's like A1 behavior.
And in this, and in that sense, I wonder, Danielle Sassoon wrote this very strong letter, compelling letter that talked about oath and duty and the people like Justice Scalia that she had clerked for and mentored her and taught her about the beliefs that she felt were being trampled on by this request. And in the normal narrative, in the normal dramas that we see over the last 238 years, that is a moment where the kind of time stops, and somebody stands up through their act of personal courage. In this case, it seemed like, to your connecting to your point you just made, David, about performative, it seems like that was used as a way to get rid of these other 6 people who resigned. And now those kinds of people who get in the way of these kinds of orders are no longer in the Justice Department. So for the project that the Justice Department seems to be under in its new creation, these acts of personal courage are helping it in its goal, which is basically to get obstacles out of the way of making this a smoother highway between the wishes of Donald Trump and the actions of the Justice Department.
Right. I mean, this is this very, I think, potent dilemma right now of resignations, that there are moments where you just feel like you can't do your job anymore and you have to resign. I really appreciated that Sassoon and Scotton wrote these letters that were detailed in their explanation. I have been somewhat frustrated by high-level folks like this week, the head of the Social Security Administration. There are others who are melting away. Like, they're leaving, but we don't really know why. And I really wish someone at a high level who's leaving because of DOGE and access to sensitive data would come forward and explain exactly what the problem is. Because otherwise the public, we need 2 barometers to judge what's happening. One is, why did you leave? What was disturbing in the moment? And then there's trying to track what the actual impact of all of this is on how the government functions. The second one is more medium to long term. But I feel like without those short-term testimonies, we're really missing a piece of evaluating what's happening.
One of the things that I think is also so unsettling about this time is you can imagine previous eras, as you say, John, it would have been a time stop moment. Also, there would have been 2 things would have happened. One, there would have been some voice in Congress that would have stood up to try to do something about this from a Republican voice in Congress. That's number one. And number 2, the media, the fact that there is now a completely in-hand right-wing media that is basically functioning as a propaganda operation for the Trump administration, like, not to be histrionic, not to oversell it, but that's kind of what's happening, means that they don't, like, the truth being out there,
they can shake it off in a different way. Confuse it.
Exactly.
Yeah. I mean, Bove immediately attacked Sassoon and the rest of them as like a bunch of hacks. And he also wrote this very strong, strident letter, and you had to spend some time understanding the merits. And I did not watch Fox, but I can't imagine they covered it in a way that was really sympathetic to the prosecutors or getting to the bottom of what was happening.
And all you have to do to get through a news cycle is just show strength, and it'll get covered as such. And then you move on. The Republican voice in Congress, we won't be talking about this, but President Trump is in the middle of rearranging the post-World War II global order that the United States was once the leader of. And in that context, he called Volodymyr Zelensky a dictator, which those people who study Russian propaganda find to be, very much of an overlap with Putin's message. And the Republican leader in the Senate, John Thune, said, well, the president speaks for himself. This is a country that the United States has stood behind for 3 years after the invasion, spent, over $100 billion supporting. And the furthest he could go was to say the president speaks for himself. So that gives you some indication where the stakes are much higher. People are dying, the limitations of the willingness to speak out against the president.
Emily, just going back to the Adams case. So Judge Dale Ho, federal judge in New York, heard on Wednesday, he heard arguments from Adams' lawyer and the Justice Department about why these charges should be dismissed without prejudice. Under the normal course of events, he would just go along with this. He did not make a decision immediately. There are people who are like, oh, he should order a prosecution of it. He can't do that. He can't force the Department of Justice to prosecute Adams. Can he do anything?
Well, so first of all, it was extraordinary that Emile Bove was the lawyer for the Justice Department making this argument, as opposed to any career person, anyone from the Southern District. I just want to point that out. I think that Judge Ho is trying to be very deliberate. A lot of things came out at that hearing. It was not true that Adams couldn't do his job. Adams had said a million times, like, yeah, don't worry, I'm under indictment, but I'm still your mayor. And this whole notion that there wasn't a quid pro quo, even though Bove and Adams's lawyer vehemently denied it, the kind of evidence for it was there in the transactional nature of what had transpired. So I think that Judge Ho did a good job of making that clear. I don't think he can order a special prosecutor here. I don't think he should. There are separation of powers problems with a judge coming in and requiring a prosecution. That's not his job. I do think this question of whether the charges can be dismissed with prejudice is within his purview and matters. I mean, there will be an irony here, I suppose.
And just to explain, with prejudice means that they could not bring them back.
Exactly. It's just a matter of like, are these going to hang over Adams's head forever or until some later date? Or do the government have to give up that leverage? And I think that Ho could say, I am only going to accept this plea deal under terms where you withdraw these charges permanently. There'll be an irony there because then Adams will be off the hook permanently. But in light of what's going on, I think both legally and politically, that feels to me like a move that is available to Judge Ho.
And the reason to do that would be to remove the sort of Damocles over Adams, which basically makes him always have to worry about the threat of being prosecuted if he doesn't do the right thing by the Trump administration.
Right. I mean, I also feel like it's irrelevant because Adams is in their pocket, but it still is important kind of formally to put that check in place. What do you guys think of this kind of campaign by public officials to persuade Governor Hochul to take Adams out of office, which she probably has the power to do as the governor of New York? Seems like the law would allow her to make that order.
Well, he's having a hard time governing the city. 4 deputy mayors, the
Right.
4 kind of most powerful administrative people in his cabinet have just resigned. Almost every one of his top advisors is been indicted or is being investigated and is not serving anymore. So he's a very hobbled mayor, and even more so hobbled now that his deputy mayors have resigned. That said, I don't know. I mean, it would be a drastic step. It would be a drastic step. I mean, he's duly elected by the people of New York. He has a term to serve. He has not been removed from office because of corruption. He's like indicted, but that hasn't been proved.
Right.
In fact, the charges may be dropped. I mean, I don't know. It seems like a drastic step.
That I feel like is the problem, which is there are just allegations. And if you choose to use his, the reporting about Adams and this agreement with the Justice Department as the reason to remove him, then you're using basically newspaper reporting to get rid of him. So it seems like the proximate evidence you could use is not proved. So what do you base it on? I mean, what do you base it on to take this extraordinary move?
Yeah, I mean, I am generally opposed to higher level officials booting lower level officials, meaning like state to city. And that has happened in southern states where governors have unseated or taken power away from local district attorneys. And I feel like the same principle, which you both just said, is here. It's just like anti-democratic. Also, the primary is in, I think, May or June. It's really soon. It's not like we're talking about a really long time. And you could imagine that if New Yorkers voted for someone else to run as the Democrat when the primary happens, that maybe that could push Adams to resign, which also seems like it would be a fine outcome.
Before we leave this topic, I'm interested in the way that Trump wants to be so deeply involved in New York. He's always been a New York creature. He's built Trump Tower in New York. He's obsessed with New York City, and he rose, of course, as this New York developer and was such a quintessential New York character. And I think he feels he wants to be the king of New York, as he said yesterday, or as he said, I think yesterday, Wednesday, in a tweet, or in whatever the stupid things he does now are called.
Post.
And whatever those Truth Social, a truthy, as he said, after he tried to cancel congestion pricing. And his willingness to kind of get down and dirty in the business of the city, I think, is super interesting. In addition to going after the mayor and putting the mayor in his pocket, he is trying to get rid of congestion pricing, which is, I think, he may or may not be able to succeed doing that, but he's certainly going to exercise a lot of will to try to do it. John, as a New Yorker yourself, what do you make of having this authority over you that isn't your mayor or your governor?
Oh, I don't, it's New York allows for a million things. But what you capture is really, and somebody who's smarter about this and goes all the way back to the origin story of Donald Trump in New York, would really has an opportunity to write a great piece about where we are right now. Because he has, from congestion pricing to Eric Adams to basically getting out of the DA's court case, he's like on the march again in New York in a way that he wasn't for a while. And that must delight him, having some way to hit back at some of the forces in the city that he doesn't like.
This episode of the Gabfest is sponsored by Home Chef. There's still cold weather, but Home Chef is delivering hearty recipes and comfort foods to help you stay cozy and warm. We had a great Home Chef adventure at my house the other night. I had a ginger tofu tacos recipe from Home Chef, all teed up and ready to go. And my 16-year-old son, Gideon, was around. And I thought, I've had such a good experience cooking with Home Chef. I wonder how Gideon would do if Gideon made this recipe. Because I've always found Home Chef's recipes super delicious, but also incredibly clear, well-constructed. And I thought, I'll just have Gideon do it. He's not much of a chef, but he's smart, and let him have at it. And here is what happened. He made an amazing meal.
I'm about to start cutting the pineapples. I've never cut pineapples before. They have they have like a different texture than I would have expected. It's kind of nice. Now I'm going to cut the scallions and then a jalapeno. I got to take the seeds out. And
he really went at it with the jalapenos.
It's a lot of jalapenos.
And I don't have the tape of it here because it would be too long, but we just gushed and gushed and gushed about how delicious this meal was. We all loved the tacos. We tore through it. Two of us basically ate tacos for 4 because they were so delicious. And Gideon had a wonderful time cooking it. That's because the Home Chef experience was so lovely. Home Chef delivers fresh ingredients and chef-designed recipes to your doorstep. And users of leading meal kits have rated Home Chef #1 in quality, convenience, value, taste, and recipe ease. And Gideon definitely would confirm that. For a limited time, Home Chef is offering Political Gabfest listeners 18 free meals plus free dessert for life. And of course, free shipping on your first box. So go to homechef.com/Gabfest. That's homechef.com/Gabfest for 18 free meals and free dessert for life. Homechef.com/Gabfest. You can tell them Gideon sent you. Must be an active subscriber to receive free dessert. This episode of the Gabfest is sponsored by Quince. Everyone enjoys a little luxury, but it is not always affordable. But it is when it comes to Quince. So I had a meeting yesterday with my big boss, a kind of formal meeting. We don't have a super formal organization, but formal enough that I had to dress. And I have a Quince performance polo, forest green, that I love, that fits beautifully. It feels great. And makes me feel powerful and capable. And I wore it, and it enhanced that meeting. And that's what Quince does. Quince offers high quality items at prices within reach. They have 100% Mongolian cashmere sweaters that my friends swear by, washable silk tops and dresses, organic cotton sweaters, and 14-karat gold jewelry. And the best part is that all Quince items are priced 50 to 80% less than similar brands. So give yourself the luxury you deserve with Quince. Go to quince.com/Gabfest for free shipping on your order and 365-day returns. That's QUINCE.com/Gabfest to get free shipping and 365-day returns. Quince.com/Gabfest. So Lord of the Rings is an obsession of a certain kind of man. Some such men are saintly and imaginative, like John Dickerson, who is the John with his blonde hair and benevolent smile is like he's the Legolas or possibly the Elrond of the Gabfest. Emily, you're the Gandalf, by the way.
Oh, well, I don't know if I deserve that, but I'll take it. I guess they're not really. What women would you even choose?
There really aren't any. There are none.
I could be Sauron. How about that?
No. That's not good.
That.
Not a woman.
I'm like it's a gap in my knowledge base. I like everyone around me loves Lord of the Rings. I've just sort of refused. It's probably bad.
You're fine. It's okay. There are enough of us out here.
Don't bother.
Fan in my own defense.
Yeah.
But I love fantasy. I probably love it.
But you definitely don't want to be Sauron. Just so you know.
Yeah.
Okay. Fine.
I think I'm probably an Ent if I'm lucky.
Oh yes, of course you are, and that's wonderful. That's a great thing to be.
In my dream, I'm an Ent. Anyway, there's this other kind of people who are obsessed with Lord of the Rings. They're sort of sci-fi, fantasy, adult, libertarian man boys like Peter Thiel and Elon Musk. And Thiel, of course, is the founder of a company, Palantir, which is the data mining defense contractor. And it's called Palantir because the idea is that Palantir is an object in Lord of the Rings, which allows you to it's a crystal ball. It's kind of an all-seeing crystal ball. You can gaze upon distant people and distant lands. And you call your data mining business Palantir because it allows you to dig into all this mass of human information and see things that should not be seen or that otherwise couldn't be seen. And I could not help but thinking about Palantir-ness, again, as Elon Musk's Doge army demanded and is very close to attaining access to the most heavily protected and secret data about you that exists. So the Social Security files, and more importantly, the IRS's files on you. Musk is claiming, Musk never claims because Musk never claims directly except when he wants to because he's actually pretending he's not a government employee. But they're claiming they needed to root out waste and fraud and abuse, and immediately, of course, they utterly diminish that claim by putting forth spouting nonsense about how there are millions of 150-year-old people who are getting paid Social Security benefits fraudulently. But they now have access to this huge well of data. So, John, this does not seem great.
No. Well, I mean, what's not great about it is that if you just look in the way you mentioned some of those claims that they've made about savings they've claimed to have had, it's just either sloppy or
deliberately they don't give a shit.
Exactly. I mean, so there's like three possible categories, none of which are good. So as David said, there were these claims that payments had gone out to people claiming to be 150 years old. That's not the case for a variety of reasons, but they just basically either willfully misstated something or misunderstood the COBOL programming language, or they are, and this is a much more human reaction, they went in thinking there's corruption everywhere, and so they see corruption everywhere. And they don't wait just a minute or two to figure out that, in fact, there were no condoms going to Hamas. So the way in which they've handled the information they found so far, claiming that people are committing fraud and then having no evidence of actual fraud, which is different than waste and abuse, suggests that they're being either super sloppy, willfully misleading, or massively engaging in behavior that leaves massive blind spots. None of that is good hygiene if you're going to have access to the most sensitive information that the U.S. government has about its citizens.
So I'm having a lot of trouble with the whole DOGE storyline. It's like really distressing to me. And I was thinking, there are a couple reasons for that. So one is we just don't know what's happening. I cannot tell what is actually going on, and I find that really unsettling. The second thing is, of all the things the Trump administration has done that there have been lawsuits over, this one feels to me like the one where the courts are the least effective vehicle. So the plaintiffs come in and they say, I'm going to take the state attorneys general because I think that was the strongest claim. They're like, our people, this is our data. We're getting hurt by this. And Judge Tanya Chutkan, who was the judge who handled the charges against Trump brought by the Biden administration, very honorable, smart judge, says, like, you got to give me something more specific here. And then she says, like, look, this doesn't look great. I can see why you're troubled by this use of the appointments clause. Musk doesn't seem to be operating through any of the normal channels, but I don't have enough to give you an emergency order to make them stop right now. So the problem here is that the plaintiffs come in, they have to show irreparable injury to get the kind of emergency order they want. They can't show it because no one is being clear about what exactly DOGE is doing. It's been obfuscated. And so the burden of proof operates in favor of continuing this incredibly unorthodox operation, which is breaking things as it goes. Like, there's no question that we're not going to be able to just dial the whole thing back. And yet the courts seem like they can't really grapple with that. And that is the second thing that's really I'm finding hard about this.
And the majority in Congress is not saying, wait a minute, slow down here. Yeah. You can't have access to not only Treasury and the IRS, but also the Cybersecurity and Infrastructure Security Agency and the United States Digital Service, which the director of that also resigned. Like, the number of different technological nodes that Musk and his team are now in control of is really quite sweeping. I mean, you have to you basically, with these stories, are discovering massive technological tentacles of the federal government that they have now taken over. I mean, the IRS and the Treasury we know of, but there's a whole secondary category of things that they have access to now, which seems quite powerful, but which I'm just learning about.
Yeah. I mean, from a legal perspective, it seems like they're going to be allowed to get this access. I mean, the president runs the executive branch. Seems like, as the person running the executive branch, you are entitled to have your people examine the systems and have access to the systems that the executive branch operates. That seems...
Except that it's a fake government agency and there are no transparency rules, et cetera, et cetera.
Yeah,
like, it really seems like the method is a problem.
The method is a problem. No, for sure. But I think, as you say, Emily, there's so much opacity about it and so much confusion about it that they're just going to get a lot of benefit of the doubt and just go ahead and proceed. And judges they're not going to stop the Trump administration from having access to their own systems, would be my guess.
And what's supposed to be the check here is political, and the political consequences of all of this. It's not as if we haven't had a lot of reporting about it or resignations, but that whole system of flashing red lights is not having its intended effect.
I don't have any real sense about, because I'm not a coder and I'm not a tech person, about what they are going to do once they have access to the code or the data. It's very murky to me. I definitely am willing to believe there could be better technology at IRS. On the other hand, a friend of mine was doing some work to change a government system, a data system at the city level in the city she worked in. And she was describing the process of doing that for some sensitive data. And it was a fucking nightmare. It was absolutely impossible. It's like an endless process. And it's really hard to believe that a bunch of 19-year-olds who've probably never even filed taxes, probably never even seen a 1040, can be on the fly improving the tax filing software of the United States and saving us money. I mean, I think they will almost certainly cause a mess. But
it's the old Sam Rayburn line. It's easier to kick down a barn than raise one up, and this would seem to be really gleeful and enjoyable if you are a chaos entrepreneur, which is you walk in, you see all this stupid stuff that people are doing, in part because of the calcified bureaucratic nature of the federal government, where procurement is difficult. You are operating on antiquated machines. You are having to fill out, stupid forms and requisitions. And if you've ever been at the wrong end of a government interaction, it does feel like you're in the movie Brazil. It makes customer service at the worst credit card company seem like Shangri-La. So these, going in and tearing that up and pointing out the stupidity and just romping is much more enjoyable than the patient, arduous task to recreate a system that serves the people if your instincts are not to create systems that serve the people as a part of public service. So it feels very unlikely. And one final thing I was thinking of yesterday, which is when you think of major failures of federal government, it's often the case that they say it's a failure of imagination. Well, that was true with 9/11, not seeing the 9/11 attacks coming, the same with the financial crisis, COVID-19. Even the acting director of the Secret Service said it was a failure of imagination that allowed the assassination attempt of Donald Trump. So who are the people inside bureaucracies that have imagination? Well, there are some who have none, and that's the definition of bureaucracy, and maybe that's what Elon Musk wants to get rid of. But there are also lots of people who've been there a long time, who know, who are the Richard Clarks before 9/11, or some of the people in the government before the COVID-19 response disaster, who know where the mistake is, because they've been around a long time. And as Michael Lewis writes, they're usually sort of 3 levels down. That experience is what's being chucked out the window, and not just chucked out the window, but also there's no need for it to be repaired or restored in at least in the way they've been behaving in this effort so far. And when you lose that, then how do you foresee the next set of challenges to come?
From a media story perspective, I kind of have the fear that when stuff starts to break, when these things don't function well in the next year or two, and Social Security checks go to the wrong address or whatever, that it's going to be continued to be blamed on the incompetence or malice of the government workers. Like, that's still going to be the story that they're going to tell. The thing that I hope for above all else, I hope if they're going to go in and monkey with stuff, that they fix it and make it better, and they discover all this waste and like, God love them if they discover billions of waste and abuse, and like there are people ripping off the government and they discover it. I would be thrilled if they're not going to discover that, but I would wish it for them to discover that. But if that's not going to happen, then I do want them to be held accountable if the stuff breaks. And I worry that they are not going to be held accountable if they go in and break everything and just continue to blame it on the deep state that is fucking it up.
Or just distract with these like lying, misleading posts about savings that don't exist, right? I mean, that's the other thing that Musk is very good at.
The error rate has really been high. I mean, also, it's really hard. I mean, it's hard.
The error rate of what?
The error rate of the things they've claimed the savings they've found.
Yeah.
All the payments, not even say them, because then we're just like broadcasting them. But yes, agree.
Oh my God. It's so crazy. I don't even know why they'd bother to go in and monkey with Social Security. I know why they go in with the IRS. They hate the IRS, even though they're going to regret it because the collections are going to plummet, or there's going to be chaos in collections and people are going to be really unhappy about that. But why even look at Social Security? Like, what do they think is going to happen?
Right. I know. I did have this thought of like, okay, well, if they're sending out, do I care as a taxpayer about extra Social Security going out? It's not high amounts it's not like people make $1 gazillion off of that. Maybe that's a super irresponsible thing to say. But of all the waste, fraud, and abuse in the government, that is like extremely low on my list. Also,
the waste, fraud, and abuse, to the extent there was at the Social Security administration, has been there have been inspectors general reports, and it has existed, and they have,
of course,
they have tried to, there's an ongoing effort to squeeze it out of it. I mean, in other words,
and it's a tiny percentage of the whole.
Yeah, that's the other thing we should mention, which is all of this, which is being done for the purposes of, so says Elon Musk, to solve the budget deficit problem, is not going to do that, or even close.
Right. I mean, there's a part of me that worries that we're all like falling for this bright, shiny object, which is all of this attention, which is in the millions, maybe small billions. And like, meanwhile, over here is the thing happening with the trillions that is boring and doesn't have like Elon Musk doing all this posturing.
Every day, thousands of Comcast engineers and technologists, like Kunle, put people at the heart of everything they create.
In the average household, there are dozens of connected devices. Here in the Comcast family, we're building an integrated in-home Wi-Fi solution for millions of families like my own. It brings people together in meaningful ways.
Kunle and his team are building a Wi-Fi experience that connects 1 billion devices every year. Learn more about how Comcast is redefining the future of connectivity at ComcastCorporation.com/Wi-Fi.
I can say to my new Samsung Galaxy S25 Ultra, hey, find a keto-friendly restaurant nearby and text it to Beth and Steve. And it does, without me lifting a finger. So I can get in more squats anywhere I can. 1, 2, 3.
Will that be cash or credit?
Credit. 4.
Galaxy S25 Ultra, the AI companion that does the heavy lifting so you can do you. Get yours at Samsung.com. Compatible with select apps. Requires Google Gemini account. Results may vary based on input. Check responses for accuracy.
This episode is brought to you by Progressive Insurance. Do you ever find yourself playing the budgeting game? Well, with the Name Your Price tool from Progressive, you can find options that fit your budget and potentially lower your bills. Try it at Progressive.com. Progressive Casualty Insurance Company and Affiliates. Price and coverage match limited by state law. Not available in all states.
We're joined by Marc Dunkelman, a fellow at Brown University's Watson Institute, the author of a new book, Why Nothing Works, Who Killed Progress and How to Bring It Back. Also, he wrote an article in The Atlantic that summarized some of those points. So, Marc, who killed progress? Why did they do it? How did they do it?
The short answer is that we progressives, after spending decades trying to build up the ability of the government to do big things, ended up seeing that big government as some sort of evil coercive power in the wake of Vietnam, in the wake of Watergate, in the wake of all sorts of environmental projects that turned bad, in the wake of Robert Moses, as explained in Robert Garrow's Pulitzer Prize-winning book, The Power Broker. And so we have spent the last 50 years trying to put guardrails around public authority. And those guardrails are all well-intentioned, almost to a one. They were all responding to true abuses of public authority. But the upshot is that we've now created a system where there's so many veto players and you need so many approvals, the government fundamentally doesn't work. So even though progressivism and the Democratic Party is purportedly the party of government, we now have a movement and a party that are undermining their own efforts to be successful.
And just to follow up my own question, what are some specific examples of that? Either ways things did work where government was working or progress was working, or ways which it is now not working, specific ways that things get stopped?
Well, just do two extremes. Sort of the quintessential example that I think is actually in Emily's husband's book, Public Citizens, is the Tennessee Valley Authority, which was this institution created in the early 30s to wire up the poor farms that weren't being served by the private utilities in the South. And so a public institution, the Tennessee Valley Authority, was established. A guy named David Lilienthal was given the authority to run it, essentially, almost like the regent of a colony. And he used federal workers and brought wires to lots of poor farms to great success. And generally, the Tennessee Valley Authority during that period is seen as this sort of revelation. The Nation magazine did this 4-part series back in the 30s of just extolling what an amazing job they did. More recently, of course, we're also got an energy problem. We're trying to get clean energy into the grid. And so one of the stories that I tell in great detail in my book is this effort to get hydropower from Canada, which is available and cheap and already available, into the Massachusetts grid. But in order to do that, you need to build a transmission line from Quebec through one of the states in New England or New York and into the Massachusetts grid. And they can't get it done. They can't find a way to do it because there are all these veto points in the system, whether it's an environmental concern, whether it's a locality that doesn't want the transmission line to go through their area, whether a private citizen brings this suit or that suit, whether there's a referendum, whether there's a siting board that is secretly in the pocket of fossil fuel, whatever it is, you've created a system where this obvious solution that you need to have if you're going to actually switch to a clean energy economy can't get done. And so we've gone from TVA being sort of one example of government being powerful and efficacious to another example of government just being sort of completely on its back.
Before you came on, we were talking about DOGE and its bent running through the government. And I was thinking that if what they were doing was trying to overturn or just run through some of these obstacles to building stuff, that I would have a different feeling about it, right? I mean, one of the big frustrations and problems for both the Obama and the Biden administration has been that they got all this funding through Congress for these big projects, and then nothing turned out to be shovel ready, and then people don't see the benefits of government working. What would you do if you could amass a lot of power to change all of this, which, suddenly from the Trump administration, at least at the federal level, looks more possible than I would have imagined?
I want to answer your question, but I want to sort of go 5 degrees in a different direction. It used to be that there was a quote unquote establishment, right? Like the real power brokers in your town or city. They were in the back rooms. You could defeat an incumbent mayor, but like there was a notion that you couldn't fight City Hall, and that was because like there was some shadowy figure in the political machine who was a real estate developer, whatever, and that was the real power. So like whatever that group wanted to do, you couldn't stop them. So progressives saw that in the 50s, 60s, and 70s and said, we are going to create barriers so that this shadowy, coercive, Robert Moses-esque institution that we call the establishment can't just do whatever it wants. And we created all these checks, so environmental checks and historic preservation, and you want to make sure that there isn't a racial element, and that no orchid is destroyed, and right, all these different things. And in order to make sure that all of those checks were checked out, we built a huge bureaucracy. So the establishment is one thing, like that's powerful people making big decisions. The bureaucracy is built up in reaction to the establishment. So today, we have a system where if you want to do a big project, it has to go through these rounds and rounds and rounds of studies. And that's what all these all these bureaucrats who Trump is firing is like that's what they do. Like it's not that they're lazy. It's that they have been given these huge tasks of making sure that the transmission line that we need doesn't do these damages unnecessarily, that every option has been studied, et cetera, et cetera. And so the irony here is that like what you would need if you're going to create these checks, so many of them that it's almost impossible for anyone to imagine how you can get anything done, then you're going to build a bureaucratic apparatus that can deal with those checks, bureaucratic apparatus, as DOGE is doing, without dealing with the fact that there are too many checks in the first place, is like not an effective way to make government more efficient. It is taking the people that are actually expediting things as fast as possible out of the system. So to me, he's doing it exactly the wrong way, right? The thing that you'd like to do is make more expeditious ways to get things done. And then when it's more expeditious, you don't need these bureaucrats to do all of these things. And then it would be reasonable to say, therefore, we can trim the size of the government. The sort of notion that it seems to me that the DOGE comes from is some notion that the bureaucrats are creating the work or that they're lazy but no, they were created purposefully for a reason because the Nixon administration and others created all these new inhibitions or these new hurdles that people needed to clear. We should clear the hurdles, and then you won't need the people that are hired to help you clear them.
That's interesting. This isn't the question I was thinking about it, but based on what you were just saying, is it a plausible thing for, let's not say DOGE, because that's mixed up in, but for someone to say, yeah, but the challenge with that approach is that the intentional process that you've just described, which is plucking these obstacles out one by one, is a kind of version of the mindset that got those individual obstacles, and that the only way you can really do it is just the wholesale removal and the rebuilding from ground up. And that basically being too careful about it embeds you in the kind of thinking that ended up leading to this accretion of obstacles that makes it impossible to actually do anything.
I mean, this is a classic case of needing to find a balance, right? We don't want to return to the days of Robert Moses. I mean, my guess is that some huge portion of this podcast listenership has either read The Power Broker or purchased it for display on their shelf. One or the other.
It's in the next room, yes. Serving that secondary.
So
correct. And so you don't like that's an effective book. It tells
literally behind me.
There you go. And we progressives have been reading it, or at least thinking that we read it, or telling people that we read it, and taking from it the notion that power corrupts and absolute power corrupts absolutely. That's been the sort of what Walter Lippmann would have called the story in our heads for the last 50 years. And I'm not here to say that Robert Caro was wrong. That would be fun to say on this podcast, but I'm not going to say it. I'm going to say that the singular lesson of that book, that powerful figures are just bad, is not entirely correct. Like you need, in some cases, some amount of executive authority to make a choice. So you have one end, Robert Moses doing things that are bad with nobody able to say no. Today, we have a system where even projects that most of us would say, yes, that's a good project, can't get off the ground because there are so many checks. Somewhere in between those poles is some sort of comfortable balance where there is a reasonable opportunity for the people that are going to be affected by a project to voice their concerns, a reasonable period to study what the environmental effects are or what the various alternatives are versus the status quo, a reasonable set of moments for people to have a voice without them having a veto. And just to bring it to present day, like we're in this yet another moment of not knowing what's going to happen with congestion pricing, this effort to put tolls in and around New York City. And there's this question of, should Kathy Hochul, the governor of New York, be able to say yes or no to it? Should the state legislature, does Phil Murphy, the governor of New Jersey, whose constituents are involved, should Congress, should the president, now President Trump seems to be trying to undermine the whole process. The thing that seems to me that no one is talking about is like, well, who do we as progressives think should decide? Like, it's going to end up now in court, right? It's now going to be a series of battles between various interest groups, and the state of New York says this, and the transportation alternative says this, and the Metropolitan Transportation Authority says this, and the federal, it's a whole mess of voices. But there's sort of this fundamental question, which FDR and probably LBJ would have answered in some certain way about who should actually control it. Certainly, Robert Moses would have had a view about who should make the decision. But instead of having a decision about, or a process that will get us to a decision that gets us to the public policy end that we want, we're going to end up having a court case where what happens is determined by the letter of the law, rather than, like, these judges are not empowered to make judgments like that. Their judgment is to decide whether a study was sufficiently complete or sufficiently thorough, or whether they believe that this person should have this right or authority. What we want is a system where we say, this is the person that should be empowered to make a decision about how much people should be charged to drive into the business district in Manhattan. What is good for the environment for everyone as a whole. And we progressives have created a system where that isn't how decision-making works.
So what you're talking about, I think, is the problem of too much process. There's also a question of how liberal groups use that process. And one of the things that I think has been striking is the way in which liberal groups assume that if there is a process, they should use it against the government, and are not very good at lifting up examples of the government working effectively or just like helping their allies, right? There's a lot of factional face-off that goes on, especially with, I think, groups in Washington, but you can see it sometimes at the state or local level as well. What is your sense of how those groups could operate differently? Is that a realistic part of your expectations here?
Well, if I were to cite anyone to talk thoughtfully about this, I would cite people to read Paul Saban's book, Public Citizens, because
that is my husband. This question is channeling him. So
that book is a terrific explication of how the groups began to think differently about this very question, because I think this is the point that gets lost. Like, at the beginning of the progressive movement, at like the turn of the 20th century, the thing that progressives wanted to do, they were frustrated that courts were getting in the way of everything. And so their idea, and this is sort of most typified by Felix Frankfurter, who goes on to become a Supreme Court justice decades later, but the core idea at that point is, how do we move obstacles out of the way so that we can have a robust executive authority that will do big things like Social Security and like the weekend and child labor laws and all sorts of good things, right? And then we get to this point where that establishment becomes much more suspect. And as Paul Sabin writes really beautifully in Public Citizens, these groups form as an antidote to the establishment. So suddenly progressivism goes from wanting to build up executive authority and make it more effective and powerful to wanting to cut down government. There's a great quote about a sort of a Naderite acolyte. One of Nader's Nader's acolytes saying that he wants to government-proof government. And that's what these public interest lawyer groups are doing. And you are the notion is absolutely right. I don't know that the problem at this point is what should the groups do, because they were formed explicitly to do this. Like it is their mandate is to hold the government accountable. The question is, do we want the legal system to give them all of these opportunities? Like, I don't know whether we need to winnow the standing that they have to bring suits, or whether we can shorten the period at which they can actually file, or whether we can, collect all of these. I'm not a lawyer. I'm just a political hack. But we've got a system here where you can see in different periods, different moments where different institutions held more and less authority. The point of my book is simply to say, we progressives once held this view that we wanted a powerful executive. We wanted there to be government authorities that could do big things, that could make discretionary choices about how we're going to solve X, Y, Z problem. And now we're in a period where we've got climate change and mobility problems, and there's great inequities in our society, and we have opportunities to get clean energy, and we should have high-speed rail, and there isn't enough housing. We need government to be able to make those decisions now, especially, and the reason that they're not able to is because of stuff that we did, and we're not even aware of our own complicity in the problem.
Marc, briefly before we lose you, on the political hack part of your brain. And it seemed like you were maybe wrestling with this in the Atlantic piece. The political moment is one in which executive power, unchecked, is a big project of progressives, which is to say, stopping Donald Trump and his. While on the one hand, progressives are out there looking for a new theory of the case to rally behind, on the other hand, they also rally quickly behind the idea that too much executive power in the hands of someone like Donald Trump is disastrous. Does that make it more difficult to make your case to slip it in there between those two impulses?
It's such a great question. Just about a year ago, the Supreme Court ruled that the Chevron doctrine was dead. And the Chevron doctrine was, and Emily, I'm gonna mutilate this, so you'll have to come back and fix it for me. But the general notion was that courts should defer in many cases to what executive branch bureaucrats determined as the best way forward on things. That was the precedent set during the Reagan administration. And so it was to leave power in the hands of the bureaucrats and the executive branch and keep the courts out of it. And when the court ruled to upend Chevron and basically taking power away from the executive branch and giving it either to the legislature, but more likely to the courts, progressives were apoplectic, right? Biden was president at the time, but notice our rhetoric and our outlook was the problem now is that the executive branch is being denuded of the power that it needs to have. Now, Donald Trump is president, and our perspective is turned utterly upside down, where we are furious that the executive branch is more powerful. I don't like what DOGE is doing. I'm not a Trump guy. I was not crazy about the Chevron decision. My general view is if government doesn't work, it's not good for progressives, and government isn't working. So my view is if you have a government that is tied up in this bureaucracy and these checks, and you've got Obama saying more than a decade ago, there's no such thing as shovel-ready projects. That wasn't because there weren't projects to be done. It was because it takes so long to do. When the government 3 years ago has invested $5 billion in building EV chargers and only 58 are built 3 years later when Biden leaves office, that is an indictment of government. We are the party of government. I think that the reason that Trump is president is because government doesn't work and people want some guy to blow the thing up. So I think the best defense we have against MAGA-ism is to make government work again, at which point our frustrations will not be spurring people to invest their political capital in Trump.
Marc Dunkelman is the author of Why Nothing Works, Who Killed Progress and How to Bring It Back. Marc, thanks for joining us on the Gabfest.
Thanks for having me. This is great.
Let's go to cocktail chatter. Government cannot build a subway, but a Gabfest host can make a cocktail. Emily,
Maybe.
you can make a mean cocktail. Actually, I have no idea if you can make a cocktail. I've never had a cocktail you've made, but maybe you can.
You'll have to come over for cocktails. Clearly, I'm going to have to impress. You definitely make me a cocktail. So we decided not to talk about Europe and Ukraine this week, but I cannot resist a point I want to make about free speech and European history. J.D. Vance gave a speech in which he was giving the Germans in particular a really hard time for what he says is suppression of AfD, their far-right party, and he was calling them anti-democratic. And I just find this idea that the American approach to free speech and First Amendment has to be exactly what Europe does too, to be so ahistorical and problematic. The Europeans have a different free speech tradition. They have the Second World War and the rise of the Nazis and fascism and the Holocaust in their background. And they have come up with a different way of thinking about free speech, which is to allow more regulation and attention to the problem of anti-democratic ideas spreading. They are extremely aware that Hitler's rise to power came through an election, and they don't want to repeat that. America doesn't have to do what they are doing, but for J.D. Vance to go over there and act as if our way is the only way and they don't have their own sets of consideration and they haven't thoroughly thought through this really disturbs me, especially because I think he is doing it in the service ultimately of, maybe actually supporting AfD, just bad, but also American technology companies, because really what has happened is the Europeans have wrestled with how to regulate the social media platforms, and this is probably going to affect their approach to AI as well. And they have tried to set some limits on rampant disinformation coursing through the electorate right before an election, and trying to figure out how to address that. They don't have the perfect answer, but we sure don't have a good answer right now. So I just want to point that out. It was deeply frustrating to me to watch that whole performance unfold.
We should add also that he said that European countries should respect the will of the voter. Obviously, he won by refusing to accept that Donald Trump lost the election in 2020, and his boss did not respect the will of the voters in that election. So that would also be something worth keeping in mind in the context of that speech.
John, what is your chatter?
I sometimes wonder what people did before they had smartphones. And one of the things they did in 1930, we had the anniversary of it this week, was that Elm Farm Ollie from Bismarck, Missouri, St. Louis, was the first cow to ever be milked in an airplane. This was
okay, of all the random things you have ever said, that is like at the top of my charming list. Continue.
Well, exactly. It was like this was a thing in 1930. I mean, of course, it was a publicity stunt, but even publicity stunts have to land within the realm of the current zeitgeist. And air travel was new. The sort of doing anything not air travel was new, but the kind of popularization of it. And so this Guernsey cow was put in the plane, and she was apparently quite a producer, and she produced 24 quarts of milk, and the milk was then put in paper cartons and parachuted down to the spectators below. And one of the famous people who was rumored to have drank Ollie's milk was Charles Lindbergh. So there's another connection to aviation history. And
fascism.
And I was going to say, and American fascism. Anyway, so, that is one of the random things that Americans were engaged in the 1930s. And you can learn more about this, by the way, at the National Mustard Museum in Wisconsin, which is the home of the man who milked Elm Farm Ollie on the flight. His name is Ellsworth Bunce.
I feel like mustard and milk are two substances that do not go well together. And why, there'd be a milk guy who's also a mustard guy confuses me.
Well, I think it was really just that the Mustard Museum is near and in the hometown of Ellsworth Bunce. But the fact that there's an even mustard museum is kind of amusing. Anyway.
He put mustard on his hot dog buns. Okay.
Oh, dear.
My chatter. It's hard to follow that one. Or maybe easy.
Yeah.
First of all, I don't think I have tinnitus. I think I've got some kind of deep congestion in one of my ears, and it's very immiserating. Continues to be
but
very.
But that means it'll go away.
I'm hoping. I now am exploring solutions to get rid of this deep congestion. That's the next step. I hope it will go away. From your mouth to God's ears, Emily. That's not my chatter. My chatter is a story I read about a very interesting experiment which attempts to understand YouTube and the nature of YouTube. And one of the problems with YouTube is, like so many of our platforms, it's a privately held platform, and there's not a lot of data about it or what's on it or like really the nature of it, because that's all held by Google or Alphabet or whatever that company is called now. And partly it's almost impossible to get a random sample of what is on YouTube. And so this researcher at the University of Massachusetts at Amherst, Ethan Zuckerman, came up with a scheme because all URLs, all the web addresses for YouTube videos have a similar structure. And he came up with a scheme to basically drunk dial URLs. Like he made millions and millions and millions, billions, trillions actually of URL calls. Like he would send a URL out. Is there a video there? If there's a video, he would catalog it and like learn, and it would be sort of getting a random sample of videos. And they sampled 18 trillion potential URLs to find 10,000 videos, which means each time it took them 1.87 billion guesses to find a video. And then they would then catalog the video and sort of say what was on it and get a sense of the size of YouTube. Anyway, I just admire the kind of Stakhanovite endurance that this computer showed in doing this exercise and finding these videos. And what they found about YouTube is not that interesting. Although I will have posed you guys this question. How many videos do you think are on YouTube?
I feel like I don't even know what order of magnitude.
Yeah.
Make a guess. Make a guess.
100 million.
I was going to say like 1 million, but I don't know. Maybe I should guess 1 billion.
So interesting. You guys are wildly off. It's 15 billion.
Oh, I should have guessed 1 billion.
15. That means there are 2 videos on YouTube for every person on Earth. That's crazy.
That's crazy.
That doesn't surprise me because I mean, there just seems to be some individuals who are responsible for 1 million videos. Because it's like, I mean, you have both the guy who is showing you how to find the vintage typewriter ribbon if you soak cloth in cow's milk, and then you have the person who is like an Instagram influencer who's doing thousands of postings. So it seems to me would be reason for there be even more than 15. Okay.
Yeah.
Listeners. We've done 15 billion episodes of the Gabfest. Also, this is our 15 billionth episode. Listeners, you have sent us chatter. Please keep your chatters coming to us. Please email them to us at gabfest@slate.com. We love seeing your listener chatters. And our listener chatter this week comes from Laura Evans.
Hello, Gabfest. This is Laura Evans from Augusta, Georgia. Today I'm chattering about a lovely story from UNC Chapel Hill. UNC's social media content producer, Andrew Lamb, set up a microphone and camera on campus with a sign that read, "Tell us something good that happened to you today." Students, faculty, and staff walked up and shared their something good, whether it was enjoying the nice weather, or seeing friends, or being excited about not being sick. Each person shared what brought them joy that day. In a Washington Post article, Lamb stated that he wanted to remind people that little things can bring just as much joy as big life-changing things. This story brought me joy and reminded me to enjoy the small daily moments. You can check out the reel on UNC's Instagram or the story in the Washington Post. Have a great week, and remember to enjoy the small moments.
That's all for our episode this week, but we have a bonus episode in your feed. We're going to talk about whether humans could survive a trip to Mars. There was a wonderful article about this in the New Yorker, and it just prompted thoughts about whether space is, in fact, our destiny. That's only for Slate Plus members, however. So if you are a member, thank you. You get that. You get no hitting the paywall on the Slate site. You get other bonus episodes from other Slate podcasts. If you're not a member, subscribe to Slate Plus directly from the Political Gabfest show page on Apple Podcasts and Spotify, or visit slate.com/Gabfest Plus to get access wherever you listen. That's our show for today. The Gabfest was produced today by Kevin Bendis. Thank you, Kevin. Our researcher is Emily Ditto. Our theme music is by They Might Be Giants. Ben Richmond is Senior Director for Podcast Operations. For Emily Bazelon and John Dickerson, I'm David Plotz. Thanks for listening. We will talk to you next week.